The story we hear today comes from the Gospel of Mark, the most original of the four Gospels, one that was probably written in 70 to 75 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We don't know whether or not Mark wrote it, somebody named Mark wrote it, or if that was a name like Mark Twain that somebody took on in order to make sure that the gospel got heard. We also do know, however, that whoever wrote it wasn't writing just to an individual or for an individual. By 70 to 80 years after the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, communities were being formed beyond just the apostles. And so Mark, or whoever wrote the gospel, is writing to communities, and probably not just one community, but an assortment of communities. Just like United Church of Santa Fe, communities who were trying to figure out what they were being called to do, who was this Jesus, and also issues around things like growth, church growth, greatness, church greatness, power, who had it and who didn't. All those kinds of questions that are fundamental human questions. Because the Gospels are written, as you've heard me and others say time and time again, under the shadow of the Roman Empire. The greatest empire in all of history. An empire that stretched from North Africa all the way up to England, from Spain all the way to the Far East. An empire that was filled with emperors whose names are often remembered in history. Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Nero, Tiberius, Caligula, all of those. With very definite ideas of greatness and of power and of glory. And if you are a member of a small, struggling, new church, living under the shadow of that empire, it was important to remember what you were called to be about, individually and as a community of faith. And so there's all these stories throughout the Gospels about power and greatness. Now the story you're going to hear comes from the end of chapter 9, a chapter of the Gospel of Mark, a chapter that begins with Jesus taking 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, up a mountain somewhere in Galilee, and there they have this incredible mystical experience. They see him transfigured, they're filled with power and glory. It couldn't get any better than that. But then they come down off the mountain, and the story continues. And then we get to the end of the chapter. And Jesus is telling his disciples, not for the first time, not for the second time, not even for the third, but only for the third time, what is going to happen. So keep that in mind, that vision of glory and power and mystery and being the chosen ones and all of that with which this particular chapter began, but then see where it leads after you come down off the mountain.
Jesús y sus discípulos went on from the base of la montaña and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his discípulos, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after they kill him, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying, y tenían miedo to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, le preguntaron, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was el más grande. He sat down, called all los 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be el último." Y les servía a todos. Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, les dijo, "Whoever welcomes one such niño in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me."
So Jesus asks, what were you arguing about on the road? They could have been arguing about all kinds of things. They didn't want to tell him because what they'd been arguing about was who was the greatest? Who was the greatest among them? It was an important question. Number one, they had three of those guys, Peter, James, and John, who would have said for sure they were the greatest. They'd had this mystical experience with Jesus on the mountain. Maybe Judas said he was the greatest because he really knew what Jesus' mission was supposed to be about. Maybe Matthew said was the greatest because he was the tax collector and he knew how to handle the finances. Who was the greatest? That's what they were arguing about. Busted. Busted. Now, arguments about who was the greatest were not uncommon in that time. I mean, it was the Roman Empire. They were always jostling for support. And if you got to be the greatest or you wanted to be the greatest and somebody else was claiming to be the greatest, well, you just did them in. Whether you're the emperor or Herod, slaughtering half of his family who were vying in competition for being the greatest king. That was a conversation that people had all the time about being the greatest. And the disciples were no exception to that rule. Of course, one could also argue that conversations about being the greatest aren't limited to the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. I mean, perhaps you've had conversations about such things as well, if only with yourself. I had a good friend in seminary who confessed one time that during prayer time in daily chapel, he would look around and see who all was really praying and who else was looking around just like he was. I have another friend serving a small, struggling church in southern Arizona who told me one time, because we always have to fill out, how many people you have in worship, how many new members you've accepted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He said if a pregnant woman came through the doors, that counted for 2. Who is the greatest? Who's the smartest? Who's the most attractive? Who's the thinnest? Who's the tallest? Who's the shortest? Who's the best? Who's the GOAT? The greatest of all time. It is in our blood, our bones, our DNA to have that kind of conversation that those disciples were having on the road. And I guarantee you that would have been a conversation in those early Christian communities as well. The United Church of Corinth, it was a great church. But they didn't have as many members as the United Church of Rome. And the Christians in Ephesus, in that church, well, they really had the greatest understanding of who Jesus was. It would have been human nature to compare and compete for which was the greatest church of all time. It's just in our DNA to do it. And notice how Jesus responds. And notice as well what had just gone on before they started having that argument. He had just told them once again what was going to happen to him. that he would be completely powerless. He would be betrayed and turned over to the Roman imperial authorities. He would suffer, and they would nail him to a cross until he died. And how do the disciples respond? They start arguing about who's going to be the greatest among them. Okay, when Jesus, you're dead and buried, who's going to step up? But again, I think that's human nature. I don't know about you, but when I hear really, really bad news, I will do everything in my power to avoid it. I've just heard that the person I've been following, that I've been given my life for, that I've somehow left everything behind, has just told me it's all going to end in dust and ashes. Well, then let me start arguing about who's going to be greatest. It is just in us to do that. But the interesting thing is that you would never find the fullness of this story in any literature about the Roman Empire. As I said, there were lots of arguments among all those emperors and striving to be emperors and kings and the whole, whoever was leader of one particular region, or tetrarch, or king, or ruler, or emperor. They had those conversations all the time. But notice how this conversation ends. Because you would never find in Roman imperial literature the kind of ending to this conversation that Jesus offered. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't get upset. He doesn't say, as he had said to Peter earlier, when Peter gave a response to Jesus' saying he was going to have to suffer and die, and Jesus snaps at him, "Get thee behind me, Satan." That's not in this story. Maybe he was tired by that time. He took a different approach. He found a child, took a child, drew the child close to him and said, if you want to be in relationship, if you want to have true power and true glory, this is your model. This is your model. If you want to have true power and true glory, be a servant to all. That's another model. Basically, Jesus takes two images, two groups of people within the Roman imperial culture, the ones who are at the very bottom of the heap, servants, aka slaves, who didn't even own their own bodies, much less anything else. That's what he tells his followers to be like. Not kings, not queens, not rulers, not emperors, not tetrarchs, not all the various other titles, but the servant, the slave. That's one image. And the other image is a child. Now, I don't know about you. I remember pictures and stories told about Jesus and children when I was a child myself. And it was always this squeaky clean Jesus surrounded by squeaky clean, polite, soft-spoken, obedient children. I could never relate to those stories. I know that comes as a huge surprise, but perhaps some of you couldn't relate either. That's not the point. Do not romanticize this story, because that's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about squeaky clean, well-behaved, obedient children. He's talking about the most vulnerable person in that culture. Because children ranked right with servants, slaves, women, people of other races, at the very bottom of the heap. They were simply property. The Roman Empire waited until they hit maybe age 7 or 8 to put to work. This is not a romantic story about trusting God or the innocence of a child. I don't know about you, I read Lord of the Flies. This is not a story about innocence. It's a story about vulnerability, about powerlessness. And Jesus says, if you're going to understand who He is or what God is about and that mystery, then you've got two choices: a servant, a slave, or a child. Powerless. Powerless. And remember, Mark is writing this to church communities. Church communities that had conversations about how do you live under the Roman Empire? Whose leadership do we really respect? What really is power in our time? My hunch is that those communities had conversations not dissimilar to the kind of conversation we're having in this country now about what real leadership is, what we're called to do, what real power is. And as Bill Moyers, the wonderful journalist and also ordained Southern Baptist preacher, said when he was receiving an award from the American Baptists, in the opening quote of your bulletin, that the stories of Jesus and Jesus himself have been hijacked. He wrote that 20 years ago. Hijacked in the name of power and glory and wealth, when in fact the Jesus story goes in the opposite direction. The Jesus story focuses and says, be a servant of all. Be like a child at the bottom of the heap. Pay attention to the needs of children. Pay attention to the needs of widows and orphans and all of the vulnerable people of our time at the bottom of the economic heap. Pay attention to those who are outside the dominant culture, either because of class or race or gender or orientation or all those things. And it's the people who pay attention to the whole family of God, pay attention to all of creation. They're the ones who show the leadership of a Christian. I think that's what this story is about. And I think it's a good story to keep in mind as we go further and further into this fall. Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger called it the humility of diversity. For those of you who might not know, he is the Orthodox settler rabbi who was one of the founders of Roots, the organization we brought to Santa Fe last weekend. And he was the one who talked about, for an Orthodox settler rabbi, the Palestinians were like the gray drab background, even though they lived less than 10 miles away from where he did. They were like the servants and slaves of Jesus' time. They didn't exist until his eyes were opened. And he talked about, in order to have conversations across those divisions of class and race and religion, one needs the humility of diversity. One needs to be like a child who understands, who knows that there are lots of ways of being in this world. And lots of ways to come in contact with and understand this mystery of God. think we need this story, the one that Blanca read so well. We need this story to be at the very heart of who we are individually and as a church as we go deeper into this fall. And as each of us and this whole nation is called to make choices about who has power and what is that power used for and how do we live into that power. And to come into those questions, remembering this story. The one who aspires to greatness is the servant of all. The one who aspires to greatness is the one who pays attention to the children, to the vulnerable, to the ones at the bottom of the heap. That, my friends, is what it means to be a Christian. To follow in the ways of this Jesus Christ, who told his disciples and tells us the only life worth living is a life given for the sake of others. That's leadership. That's power. That's our choice. Thanks be to God. Amen.